After watching this video, you'll be a master at using the ISO in your camera and also low light shooting. So let's go. Let's just start by looking at these two videos here that I recorded using the dual native ISO in my camera, the Panasonic S1. One ISO is at 640, the other one is 4000. Of course, like most of you already know, the higher the ISO, the more noise you get into the image, so on and so forth. But then there's a lot of misconception that when you are shooting low light, because you need to have more light and sometimes you don't have the compensated light in the scene to capture in the exposure you want, that you should just up the ISO and that will change and make you able to capture better images at night. We can already see out of the box, okay, this is bypassed with my color grading, that this first video, okay, has a higher spill of light. So you see here on wooden wall and the regular wall here in the back that there is more light coming in, okay, in this first video, and you soon understand why when we talk more about the theory part of this. But okay, let's come here to the color tab. I'm using the DaVinci Resolve. You can use Premiere, whatever you use for color grading. This is just to show as an example, okay? I'm bypassing right now color, but here it is, the full thing that I did. I just fixed here the exposure itself, okay? And then here I added a bit of saturation so we can see the colors better. And then here I've added a bit of contrast, but I'll pause the contrast for now on both clips, okay? And let's just close here let's close here the nodes, and then let's just take a first evaluation at 100% here at our image. So like we would expect, we see here in the dark there's a lot of noise in this first video, and in the second one still a lot of noise, but it does feel that there's more quality in the second video. Okay, by now you probably also know that the first video is the higher ISO 4000, the second video 640, but you can already see the difference, not only in terms of the sharpness and the quality of what we are getting in the darker part of the video here. Of course, there's still noise here, but it's just a different type of noise. It's more pleasant to see this noise here. And also the shift in the colors is also quite high, which is funny to see that you maintain the exposure, you maintain the light in the scene. Just by pushing your ISO way higher, you are going to get a lot of color shift, which is going to also get in the way of matching your color. But okay, why I added this contrast on the top, just for us to understand, is that this first one with the higher ISO looks really muddy. So I'm trying to compensate a bit of contrast to see if that does solve the quality issue that we are getting with this higher ISO. But then here, same footage in the second one. And you see that out of the box also is not as muddy as the other one. But then when we do add contrast, it does behave better, meaning that it's more pleasant to look at. The colors are nicer. The lights are behaving better when I'm pushing this contrast on top of it. And you just see, it feels like completely different images, and you would expect that this native ISO would give you, let's say, the same quality on both images. So basically, just as a start, if you want to stop the video now, you can already see, if you want to get the most amount of quality from your low light images, you should use your lower ISO, your native, that usually is 400, 640, and try to optimize as much as you can in terms of the light that you have in the scene and the other settings, so shutter speed and aperture. But now let's dive a little bit more into the theory of this so we can fully understand why this is happening to our footage. Most of the consumer cameras that we have, they are better at handling overexposure than underexposing. Why is that? For example, when we film something where we clip the dark, that means that when we try to pump up the dark again and reveal detail out of that, is not only going to be super grainy, but most of the time we are not going to be able to recover it. But when we do that with the highlights, when we push the highlights a little bit, we can still recover details there. So what does that mean? Is that when we are recording in our camera, there is a really famous technique of exposing to the right. That means that we are trying to overexpose to be able to capture more dark into our camera sensor. And then on post-production, we bring this down because we can recover it. At the same time, we are not clipping the darks. But how does that even relate to ISO? Basically, just changing the ISO is going to affect how sensitive your sensor is to light. It's not going to allow for more lights to come in into your camera, but actually how digitally or this light that is being processed by your sensor in your camera is being captured. I'm going to make it as clear as possible for you to understand. So first, what is going to affect the amount of lights coming in to your camera? That's the aperture and the shutter speed. Usually, shutter speed needs to be fixed because you're doing the 180 degrees. Well, you can change. It's not like you always have to do that. Of course, you can change, adapt, whatever. But we're not going to talk too much about the shutter speed. It's basically, you're going to stay at 50 or 120 if you're shooting at 60 FPS. I shoot almost all the time at 24, so I just put my shutter speed usually at 50. On my camera I can put 180 degrees and then okay, everything fine. If you don't know about 180 degrees, just put on Google. Well, before finish this video and then after you can go there. Now the aperture, we are going to be opening up, okay, the aperture in our lens, meaning that more light comes in. So for example, 1.8, we have more light coming in. Then we start to close it down, meaning that the aperture goes all the way to, let's say, 21. We have less space for light to come in. This is affect how much light is being captured by your camera. When we bump the ISO up, all these variables of the aperture plus the speed are not changing how much light your camera is capturing. It's just changing how sensitive your camera digitally is to that light. So that's the first misconception that is important to understand, that when we bump the ISO up, this is not making us exposed to the right because the light in the scene is still the same. So does that mean then that we should always use a lower ISO whenever we are filming, independently if it's a dark scene or a bright scene? Well, it's not like that. So when we have a lower ISO, that means that we are in generally pushing our aperture lower in terms of the number of the aperture, so opening up, and having, well, maintaining, of course, usually we maintain the shutter speed, but let's say that we are also aiming to have a less or a slower shutter speed to allow more light to come into the camera, especially if we are in a dark scene. So in this case, when we have the ISO 400, for example, or in this camera that I'm using, the S1 640, that would be my native ISO, means that my aperture is at 1.8 with the 50 speed. The speed on my shutter is at 50 frames per second, meaning that I'm taking the most amount of light that I can from the scene, and the ISO is not bumping up the signal ratio to cover for, let's say, less light coming through the sensor. But that also means that in the opposite scenario, okay, when I have here, I will be pushing this dynamic range of my camera lower when I'm using the ISO of 4000, which is the dual native ISO of my camera, okay, that I'm going to be compensate for this sensor receiving more light by opening up my aperture, meaning that I'll be here, let's say an example, use an aperture of 8 and okay, maintaining the shutter speed, but that means that in the actual scene, the light that I can get is darker because of what? I'm letting less light coming into my lens. And this is the opposite, more light is coming to my lens. So you see here that I have more information here on dark without clipping the dark, while here I have less information in the dark, so I'm clipping the dark, but I have more information in the light. So what does that mean? that usually if you want to capture more light in a bright daylight, let's say, scene, that having a higher ISO will help us to capture or leave this room for more light to come into our lens, because we are compensate with the aperture. And the same goes for the darker scene. So like I said, most of us would think that to capture the most amount of information in our cameras on a darker scene, we need to push the ISO and bump it up as much as we can. And that actually leaves less information in the dark. So in a nutshell, what I would say is, for darker scene, try to maintain your native ISO, the lower part of our lower ISO. When you are in a brighter scene, you can push your ISO a little bit up. I wouldn't go as far as the dual native ISO of your camera. So for example, on my camera, when I go for this ISO of 4000, I get a lot of shift in the colors. And if I don't have, for example, this card here with my colors to on post-production, making sure that everything is being correctly targeted or landing in the correct colors, I will have a color variation between my shots and also the grain variation. So I hope this explanation helped you to really see what is the impact that your ISO have, especially on your dark scenes when you are trying to record your videos in a darker lit scenario like the one that we are now. If you find this content useful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe. There's a lot of good things coming up. I post everything related to art here, so you see Blender, you see 3D, you see photography. So just come, enjoy, hang out, and hopefully you learn something nice. See you on the next one.